of minutes when everyone's had a chance to get on. Anyone wants to chat or make a contribution, just ping us a note in the chat function, which is at the bottom of the of your screen in the middle. For people who are just joining, hello and welcome. We're going to start in about a minute's time, so we'll just wait for a few more people to join us and then we'll kick off. Okay, so I think we'll get going. Thank you everybody for joining this webinar today. We really appreciate you joining us. So we're going to be sharing our learning and our thoughts about how to partner with a tech company when, as a health researcher, you're developing a mobile application or a website. And the reason that we're running this webinar is that we do lots of work with academia, and we know that if digital's not your thing, then it can be a really hard thing to understand. So we want to try and make that a little bit easier and help you think through the sorts of things you ought to consider and the sorts of conversations you ought to have with potential tech partners. So if we could move the slide on, please. I'd like to start by introducing us. These are the speakers today. So my name's Victoria. I'm with the Mindwave Ventures team. I joined the team back in December. My background is NHS and academia myself, and prior to Mindwave, I worked in the NHS for a very long time. So that's me. Sarah, would you like to introduce yourself? I think you might be on mute, Sarah.
I was, sorry. Hi everyone, I'm Sarah. I lead the design team at Mindwave. I've been with them for just over 3.5 years now. Before that, I worked both agency and in-house, but predominantly working with health-focused clients or charity clients. So I worked with Macmillan, I worked with Blood Cancer UK, lots of those types of people. So always had a focus on health and pro-social kind of things as a UX and UI designer.
Thank you, Sarah. Elle, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, hi everyone, I'm Elle. I'm a product manager at Mindwave. I've also been there for just over 3.5 years, and it's my day-to-day role is to translate kind of client needs and requirements into what the developers and designers are working on, and keep everything ticking over and manage the clients as well. Before Mindwave, I've worked in a variety of industries, including travel and events, but I'm very much enjoying working in technology because it's very satisfying seeing things coming from the ideation phase right through to delivery.
Thank you, Elle. And we're really delighted to have Professor Jo Neal with us as well. We've been working with Jo over the last bit of time to develop a mobile application. And so Jo's going to bring her experience and perspective to the conversation as well, and maybe share some of the things that, that you've learned along the way from working with us, Jo. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi everyone, delighted to be here. I'm Jo Neal. I am a qualitative researcher and I work in the National Addiction Centre at the Institute of Psychiatry, Psychology and Neuroscience at King's College, London. So most of my work is really researching people who use substances or are in recovery and homelessness as well.
Thank you very much, Jo. If I could have the next slide, please. So just very briefly, a bit about Mindwave. We design and develop digital products and services in the sort of social space. We actually are a spin out from Maudslay's Biomedical Research Centre. Our founder has a games development background, but was a non-exec director of South London and Maudsley when he created one of the very first personal health records. So we work with healthcare, we work with academia, and we also work with startups and charities. So that's a little bit about us. If I could have the next slide, please. And just in terms of who this session is for, well, it's for anyone really with an interest, but we're particularly thinking about health researchers in universities such as Jo, and also clinical researchers in the NHS. And as I said before, what we really want to help you think about over the next sort of 50 minutes is how to partner with a design and dev team to create a mobile application or a website. Next slide. So the do's, the don'ts, and the case study through Jo. And how I'm going to conduct this, we're going to have it as a bit of a conversation facilitated by me. You're all on mute, but if you would like to use the chat function to ask questions, share resources, make comments during the session, I'll keep an eye on those, and hopefully there'll be a little bit of time towards the end to pick up on some of those. So if I could have the next slide, please. And what we hope you'll take away from this is how you set requirements, how you work collaboratively. We've got some thoughts to share. You might have some to share back with us through the chat. How you build a successful relationship and, most importantly, achieve your research goals. Next slide, please. Just want to say a little bit, we've got a few ways of thinking about this, but I wanted to share with you a typical sort of digital innovation pathway, and this is adapted from Nesta's innovation pathway. And it's just thinking beyond the products. It's very easy to get caught up and think solely about a product or a service, but to think about the whole sort of life cycle. So we often start thinking about problems and challenges that we want to solve. We start to generate ideas and hypotheses. At that point, we start to design, to develop a product or a service, and we're going to talk about some of that process. But then once we've actually designed and developed a product or service, we also then need to be thinking about onboarding, how we engage with potential end users, how we sustain delivery, how we implement maybe within a clinical workflow or a pathway, and then of course how we start to generate evidence and sustain over time, if indeed that's the purpose of the mobile application that you're building. But I've put this slide up just because I want you to think really sort of broadly and beyond a product about the different stages in that digital innovation pathway. Next slide, please. And some of you might be familiar with the fact that the NHS has a series of design principles, and I've put the link at the bottom there should you want to click through to the NHS digital standard. It's a really useful sort of compass for any sort of work that we do, and Sarah will just pick out a few key points from this set of principles, but they're the compass, they're the guide for all the work we do. And for me, the most important one there is the putting people at the heart of everything you do. It's always thinking about what are the challenges and the problems people are trying to solve, and how could some technology help them do that differently or better. Sarah, is there anything you'd like to comment on the design principles?
Yeah, I think just that it's sort of basic UX. So UX stands for user experience. So it's really just thinking about the user experience from the end user's perspective. And we'll go a little bit into how we do that as designers and how we would work with you to do that. But really it's about what is the problem that your user is having, and how can you improve it or fix it. So designing for the outcome, so what's the goal that people want to achieve, testing your assumptions, because often we think that we know our users better than we do, or we think that we are our users. Sometimes that's the case, but we're not every user. So we need to make sure that we're thinking about what assumptions we might have and then validating them, which I'm sure as researchers you guys are all really familiar with.
And I think just to pick up on a final point there, the designing for context for me is an incredibly important one as well. It's very easy to design and develop for the perfect user in the perfect context. But as we all know, life is messy, and none is more messy than the complexity of the NHS if you're designing or developing a digital tool to be used within a health sort of context. And it's well written about and recorded, all the challenges and the complexity within the NHS. So a really strong design process helps you elicit some of those challenges, some of those barriers, and helps you design and develop something that actually will work in the context it's intended for. So that one should not be underestimated. Okay, we'll move on to the next slide, please. So I'm going to hand over to Sarah now just to talk about a typical approach, which is our approach, but will be the approach of most other tech companies that you might want to work with. So Sarah, would you like to just pick up here and talk about this sort of particular approach?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is based on the Design Council's double diamond approach. So we've sort of combined a few other examples in with ours just to make it a bit more true to how we do things. So really the key thing for us when we're working with new partners is that the first two green triangles, the research and empathy. So really trying to understand, interrogate the problem that it is that we're trying to solve. I think often we look at the consequences of the problem that someone's facing rather than the cause of the problem, and we really need to understand both. We need to understand who the problem is happening to, why, when, as Victoria was saying, all of the context behind it. And we try and do that in a really, really broad way, try and get all of the information that we can, try and create a really, really detailed big picture. And then we go into the narrow and refine, trying to figure out exactly what it is that we want to do to solve the problem. And then we broaden back out when we start ideating. So trying lots and lots of things, trying lots of ideas really quickly, trying to fail fast. That's really important. So we know what doesn't work and we can rule it out. And prototyping. So the prototyping is really important. We try things out with people, make sure that we've understood our research and our empathy, that we've defined it correctly, and then we can make sure that we are actually meeting the needs that we've set out. So we'll talk a little bit about personas as we come to that bit, but really we're trying to make sure that what we are creating is meeting the needs that we've established in the beginning, and the validation thing is then really important. So lots and lots of ideas, and then try and narrow them down into something that's really well defined and is meeting all of the user's needs. And that's not just our end user, our participants, if we've got participants, our patients, if we've got patients, but it's also the researchers, the clinicians, everybody who's involved needs to be able to achieve what it is that they want to achieve.
And is it worth just touching on the word research, because we probably use research in quite a different way than an academic would use the term research. So maybe just say a little bit more about the sorts of tools we would use, the methods we would use to do that research.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it'd be interesting to bring Jo into that bit as well, because I remember when we first started working together and I came in and ran some sessions, and I think although we used different language, there were a lot of commonalities between what we were trying to do and what you were trying to do. We just might go about them in slightly different ways. So we often spend a lot of time speaking with people, interviewing people, doing workshops, trying to understand the full landscape of what somebody's experiencing within the context of the project. So most of that is really talking to people and then analysing that. And that might be surveys, but often we do a lot of face-to-face. And then as we'll come to, we move into personas and trying to kind of create characters that we are catering to, so that we always have someone to fall back to. We're not looking at just an individual and trying to solve that problem. We're trying to cater to quite a broad range of people. But Jo, I don't know if you want to add anything in there about...
Yeah. I think it was very interesting because when we came to Mindways, we thought we'd done the research. We thought we knew what it was that we wanted. So when we first started working with you, it took us a little bit of a while to work out what it was you were doing, because you were talking to us about research. And I think we were that we've done the research. But then over time, it became a lot more apparent that really you as the app developer also needed to understand the group we were working with. We couldn't actually transmit that to you by osmosis. So we had to go with you whilst you did research as well, so that the team fully understood. And then I think that really helped us much further on down the line, because we knew that you knew what we knew, which is circular way of doing it. And I kind of wish we'd have known that at the beginning, because we could have probably facilitated you a bit more in the beginning had we known that we were effectively doing the same thing but using slightly different terminology.
Yeah,
there's a really good insight, isn't there? So, and I think that's one of the things that we're really keen to do, and it might be, as researchers, one of the things you want to talk to a company such as ours about doing is how do we collaborate, and how do we make the most of the different types of research we're doing, or do them in such a way, you doing your research in such a way that it can be taken and used by a designer and a developer. So I think those sorts of conversations really early on are very valuable to have.
Yeah, and I think we'll get to it a bit later, but really that ideation and prototyping session, we're really trying to bring in good user experience into that point. We want people to be able to use the app to their benefit as well as the benefit of the researchers, otherwise they're not going to do it. So hopefully at that point we are starting to think about how to make things more engaging, what's the benefit to all of the users, to try and keep engagement up.
Thank you, Sarah. Could we have the next slide, please? So we all have our jargon, academics and the digital world, and we just thought it would be useful to introduce you to some sort of ideas and typical ways in which we work. So we're going to take you through a typical process from early stage discovery through to creating an alpha, a beta, and then going live. So we're going to break that down into 4 stages and to describe what those words mean and what we do at each phase. So if we could have the next slide, we'll have a little look at discovery. Now, Sarah's already talked about the double diamond approach, but Sarah, could you maybe just talk a little bit more about that working in sprints and iteration, please?
Yeah, I think actually Elle might be better placed to talk about that, just in terms of the process and the management of the project.
Yeah, that's
sure.
great, Elle. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so once the discovery phase has been completed and we've got a good idea of what it is we're going to build, we would then move into the kind of alpha and beta phases. And the alpha phase is focusing on design, but getting that kind of click-through version that you can show end users and test with, and ensure that it is something that's going to kind of meet their needs. And then when we move into the development cycles, so we work in 2-week sprints, and we do this because it's a very common way of working across development, but it gives the opportunity to get user feedback regularly and to check in and ensure that you're always working on the thing that's the highest priority. If you don't work in kind of shorter sprints like that, you might risk going ahead and building an entire product, but then realizing that a lot of the stuff you've done isn't essential or isn't actually meeting the user's problems or needs. So it's important to kind of keep iterating and keep pivoting slightly to ensure you're always on the right track. And yeah, I was going to say about the after that, obviously, the rollout and getting people to use your product. It's very important, I think, especially if your budget and time are constrained, as they often are. It's very important to start with the minimum viable product, the MVP. And it's especially important to do this because, as I said, if you think that you know what your users might want, and you go ahead and build this whole all singing, all dancing product, you might then take it to use with the users, and they start using one part of it but completely ignore a whole other bit that you've built and spent lots of time and effort on. So drilling down and getting that essential part of it and starting just with that and letting it be shaped by real user feedback is really important.
So Jo, can I bring you in here, because I know this is a really different way of working that you might do in academia, and we've already had a question about ethics approval. So how different did you find this sort of sprint-based approach, and how what's your steer around getting ethics approval?
Okay, before I address the ethics approval, going back, looking at the diagram now and hearing you talk about this, it takes me back to the time when I wrote the protocol, because we were developing an app, but I had to secure some resources to develop the app, so I had to write effectively a research protocol, but it wasn't a research protocol, it was really a protocol for developing an app. I did all of my bits and that was fine, and then I contacted you because we needed your costings. And the costings were broken down into these really weird things like sprints. And I was like, what's a sprint? And I was trying to write the protocol whilst at the same time getting my head around these different terms. And again, it's a shame I didn't know then what I know now, which is what this terminology means, because the sprints later became just so important to us, because we did so much in small bursts, just as Elle has suggested, to make sure that we didn't make massive mistakes and then have nowhere to go. In terms of ethics approval, sorry, I haven't seen the question, but what we got ethics approval for was not to build the app, but what we had ethics approval for was to use any data that came in through the app for research purposes. So we submitted a research ethics application to King's College London, to their ethics committee. And actually we submitted two. The first one that we submitted was a very general one, and we just said we would like permission to analyse the research data that comes in a very general way, just to make sure that the app's working as it should be, that the data looks like it should be, and to do some exploratory work on it. Now, actually, leaping forwards, we're about to use the data for research purposes. So we've had another ethics application submitted and accepted, and that's to actually answer specific research questions with the data that comes in through the app. So we did it in stages, ethics application, based on what we needed as we went.
Thank you, Jo. And I guess that the lesson is about trying to align maybe the milestones and the constraints that you're operating with a typical approach of an agency, and how do you balance those two things together? So it's finding a partner who can flex with the constraints and the time scales that you have. Yeah. Okay, if we could move on to the next slide, please. And we're going to spend a little bit of time in that first stage about researching problems and challenges that Sarah's already introduced, but we're going to delve into that a bit more deeply. If we could have the next slide, please.
Yeah, and I'll mention a little bit about ethics here as well. So these photos are actually from a different project that we did, a much bigger project, and we engaged with lots and lots of different groups. And actually, one of the ways that we can get around the ethics side of things is that as Mindwave, as an independent company, we don't have to get ethics approval. So if we're doing a piece of discovery work, we can speak to whoever we want about whatever we want to understand things from our perspective. So as Jo said earlier, we need to understand the landscape and the experience of the users as well. So if we're doing a piece of discovery, we can do that by ourselves without having to get the ethics approval. I mean, we're most of us are DBS checked, and obviously we get consent for everything, so we have a lot of forms that we have to get filled in by people, particularly if we're going to use photos of them, but also to take part in the user research. So we do get consent, follow GDPR for everything like that. We have proper governance guidance if we're keeping user details and all of that kind of thing. But discovery, so there's lots of different ways that we're going to gather information. So we, as you can see on the screen, we've got some card sorting. Sometimes we do wireframes, we cut them up, get people to move them around, really start to delve into some of the problems and the content that's already out there. Lots and lots of sticky notes and post-its, as I'm sure you'll remember, Jo. And really kind of just delving in and interrogating all of the problems. And then when we start kind of trying, getting some themes out of those initial discovery sessions, we'll delve into those a bit more, start validating. So you can't really tell from all the pictures, but we do a lot of card sorting around terminology. So that essentially means we think that we've got some topics that we want to put into our app or to our service or to our product, and we'll get people to group them, so we can start thinking about our navigation, how people might get from one place to another. So if we're grouping pieces of content, we'll ask people to name them, so we're not putting words in people's mouths. What are the types of language that people are already using around that topic, and making sure that we're not using too much jargon, that kind of thing. If you want to go to the next slide, Julia. From all of our discovery, ideally what we do is create personas. So as I touched upon earlier, what that means is really creating characters, typical characters that would be using your service or product. And you're looking at, and again, it's a bit blurred on the screen, but you're looking at things like motivations, challenges, touch points, the background. And really what you want to do there is create, make sure that you're covering all of the bases of all of the types of people that you're catering to. So you could potentially have a set of personas for your patients, for your clinicians, for your researchers, all of the groups of people that you want to cater to. And in big corporations, you often find that they'll create personas and they'll make life-size cutouts of these people and bring them into the room. So when you're talking about your product, talking about updates, talking about designing something new, you're always looking back to the people that you're trying to cater to, rather than thinking about it from your own internal perspective. Not that the organisation's needs aren't also important, because they are.
That's very helpful, Sarah. And I think what I'm struck by with that co-creation process that you showed with all the workshop activities is it's a really engaging way to involve people and get their participation. It can be a great leveler, actually, and it adds a different layer. People sort of doing and designing in real time is quite a different thing to talking about things in a focus group environment, for example. And I think that's something you'll find with design and development companies. They'll want to sort of get stuck in and get people co-creating and co-designing with them, which is really powerful.
I think what we find often, I mean, working with the NHS particularly, and a lot of clinicians, we often find that it's really hard to get all of the different groups of people to imagine what something could be. And we can talk about it from an abstract point of view, but until we put something down on paper and they can rip it to shreds and tell us it's all wrong, we can't really learn anything. So we really need to get something in front of people as soon as possible.
And Jo, you had a really good user group, didn't you, with the project that we've worked with you on. Could you just say a bit about how you found that discovery sort of persona development process, and did it feel quite different to what you're used to?
Yeah, so the first thing to say is that there were at least 5 episodes or stages, if you like, as I'm aware of. So there was some interviews, there was workshop, more interviews, another workshop, and then another workshop. And so I was only actually involved in the final workshop. But we work anyway prior to the app with an addiction service user research group. And they are the collaborators with us on the research that underpins the content of the app. So we had a pre-existing relationship with them. So they were very much central to everything that went on, and they participated in some of the workshops and interviews. Obviously, we wanted to go beyond them, otherwise it would have just been an app developed for one group of people. But they were certainly central in guiding us throughout the whole process, but also participated in some of these early exercises.
Thank you, Jo. And there's some really good questions coming through the chat, which I'll just, in case people haven't seen them. We were asked, how many people do you interview in a persona development before you try and keep getting the same answers? Is there an industry standard? And it's around 12 per user group, and you is it about 8 to 12 per sprint as well when you're doing user testing, Sarah?
Yeah, so I've just answered on the chat as well, but yeah, usually around 12 per user group, and then you do start getting a lot of the same similarity, but you do need the similarities to obviously validate your points. But around 12 per user group for the depth interviews, or you can also do those in focus groups, but it's really nice to do those depth interviews. You really do get to know the subject matter much better. For user testing, when you're starting to test out prototypes, actually you start seeing the same patterns after around 5 people. So, you know, you could do, if you're just testing out, as we're saying, iterating quite quickly, test something out with a couple of people. So if there's anything kind of going wrong, make a small amend, test it out with another couple of people, and then around 5 people to really define what the issue is and make the feature better. That's really all you need. So the Nielsen Norman group have a lot of really good info on that, but also government digital service guidelines have really good advice around that, and they actually recommend less is more for a lot of this stuff, because you really don't want to be spending all of your time just getting your numbers up for your user testing and your research. But for the interviews and discovery, around 12 per user group.
Thank you, Sarah. And you've brought us nicely onto the next slide, which is Alpha, and this is when you start to design your product. So if you could just move us on to Alpha, and then straight onto the next slide, please, Julia. And Sarah, back to you just to talk about that sort of Alpha sort of early stage design process.
Yeah, so these are actually shots from the report that we did for SURE, the project that we did with Jo. So when we're getting into Alpha, we are starting to define, and this might have been some of the ones that you're involved with, Jo, but you're starting to think about what's an appropriate name, what's an appropriate brand, what's this thing actually going to look like. So I think we've got an example there from workshop 1, which would have been in Discovery. So you can see the post-its there with little sketches on. We were sort of getting people to identify some of their experiences in post-it note stickmen form. And then workshop 4 and the naming exercise, you can see we're starting to be a bit more visual. So lots of sticky dots, voting on things that people like and don't like, visual mapping exercises, trying to make sure that we're getting the right tone both in content and design. But really the alpha phase is about having a really strong plan for what you're going to build. What does it look like? What's it going to be called? What sort of features are going to be in there? And how long is it going to take? Elle, I don't know if you want to add anything to the alpha stuff.
No, I mean, this process, we had a lot of time with Sure, which was really great to do a full discovery in alpha like this. And I really enjoyed being part of that process and getting everyone's ideas and showing the different visual representations of what the app could and couldn't look like and getting feedback. It's quite a fun process, definitely. So yeah, no, I don't have particularly anything more to add other than what you said.
We had a question, thank you, Elle. We had a question about recruiting users, and it sounds like with the Sure project with Joe already had users for us to test with, but I know it's not an academic example, but I just wonder whether you could briefly talk about the Good Thinking website for Londoners, and because I know that we had to be quite creative with getting hold of users for user testing there.
Yeah, so actually Sure was one of the best projects that we've worked on with regards to engagement with users. There was such great engaged groups, and I think that's probably down to your team, Joe, is that you are quite engaged with the group anyway. And we had really, really good feedback from everybody just wanting to get involved. With Good Thinking, because it was a London-wide project and the user base was so much broader, we actually used a lot of online advertising and comms to try and recruit specific groups, partly because we wanted to be able to test the differences between those groups and the content that they wanted to engage with, but partly because we wanted to get lots and lots of people using it. So we used Google AdWords to find out what people were already looking for online and make sure that we were using those words in the places that those people already were online. So you can identify, where groups of people are having conversations, essentially. A bit stalkery, but obviously all anonymous. But yeah, there are lots of different ways that we can do it. And actually, if you've got big budgets, so big corporations use specific recruitment agencies to do that, to find your participants, make sure that they're really broad and meet the criteria that you need. So there's lots of ways to do it. And on smaller projects, internal projects, lots of friends and family user testing and recruiting. So we all know lots of people, we're all connected to lots of people online most of the time. So pushing things out that way is free. It's not as it's not as effective necessarily because people might not show up because it's just a favour. So incentives are often a good way to get people engaged. That obviously then has an impact on your ethics approval. Some organisations are able to offer incentives, some aren't. If you're going to use a recruitment agent, you're looking at around £120, £150 per person to pay the recruiter and to incentivise. So they recommend around £50 per person plus travel expenses. So you've really got to weigh up the pros and cons of your numbers, how many people you need to engage in a pilot versus user testing versus discovery, and where you want to spend your money.
Thank you, Sarah. And if we could just move on to the next slide, I suppose by the end of Alpha, we've sort of laid out the service, the digital product service, before we started coding it. So at this point, we've got wireframes, which are visual representations, but could you just take us to where we get to at the end of Alpha?
Yeah, so workshop 3 there was a number of different styles that we got people to vote on, so we could make a clear decision moving into our build what style we were going to use, what branding we were going to use. And then you can see there on the right, you've got, it's a visual user flow. So we don't always do them in this way. Sometimes we'll just do them in sort of boxes like a typical user flow. This one is much clearer. So you're just showing how all of the pieces interconnect. So the developers know what buttons need to do, what things need to happen. So something like this, you might build out a bit further. If you've got kind of any email engagement or text engagement, you put that in. So you're really mapping out the full service, all of the systems that need to interact with something. So if you're integrating with another system like RedCap or whatever systems you might be using, and you need to push data or pull data from that, you'd also want to be mapping it at this stage so that the developers have everything that they need to be able to build the full thing.
Thank you, Sarah. If we could move on to the next slide then, which is beta, and then move straight on to the slide afterwards. So this is where we get into the actual the building and the coding of a website or an application. And Elle, maybe you could just say from a project manager point of view, thinking about the academic as the client, and then we've got our developers and our designers. Just talk to us a little bit about how you manage the project, because we shouldn't underestimate how important project management is in this to keep the show on the road.
Yeah, I mean, as I mentioned earlier, so we work in 2-week sprints, and we'll try and make sure that there's contact with the client, so the academic research team, in every sprint, just to make sure that we're always on track and going according to the plan, according to priorities. But it's also important to remain slightly flexible. You don't want to be completely fixed. And so on this slide, you'll see, we go through various iterations. Like the middle slide, an example from a project that we worked on, Good Thinking, which you mentioned before. It shows the transition of what it looked like kind of at the end of alpha, what we thought it should be, to kind of what we ended up with at the end of beta. So it's kind of using user feedback and also just ensuring that we're always catering to the user needs. But with regards to kind of managing it as a whole, it's very important with lots of moving parts on a project to ensure you have say like weekly catch-ups. You also use kind of collaborative tools to keep in communication, and things like Trello, which is an easy site which helps to kind of manage a project collaboratively as well. And we'll talk a bit about those tools later on as well, I think.
Thank you, Elle. And Jo, just an input from you. I'd be really curious to know where we ended up in beta with you. How different was it than what you imagined at the outset of the project?
Yeah, it's very interesting. So at the point where you started to do the wireframes, we tried to get involved in that as well. And it was taking us some time to get our head around. So it was one of my colleagues, Alice, was taking the lead on it. And we worked with some statisticians to help us try and work out where bits of different data were going to go in for the research questions. Thinking again about Elle and the project management, that was so important, because we did find things that needed to change once we saw the wireframes, once we saw things starting to be developed. And also we had serendipitous suggestions still coming to us, like the naloxone feature that went into the app was somewhat late. The changes to the graphs that were done were somewhat late in the day, and that was because feedback to us was suggesting that we should take things in a slightly different direction. So having Elle there as the manager, we had a very clear system, which was Alice, who worked with me, worked with Elle, and they worked very, very closely in contact all of the time. Rather than getting things very confused, I tried not to email Elle. It always went through Alice, and that kept the channel, I think, pretty clear. And those two were very responsive to each other. So things were able to move backwards and forwards quite quickly and didn't create any hold-ups.
Yeah, and it's important to, it's also in a project like this, or in any project really, it's important to have a change process in place. So obviously you have the plan, and that's kind of what you think you will build, but you have to remain flexible. And if a new feature gets suggested by users or kind of pops up as a really good idea, we'd have a kind of simple process whereby I would take it away and get an estimate for how much extra that would cost if necessary, and how much extra time that might take. And then it can be, it's down to yourselves as the client to decide whether you want to prioritize that or something else. So it's important to remain flexible, but within these kind of processes to keep everything together.
And I guess, Elle, you would also reinforce Jo's point that it's really important to have an equivalent to you on the client side as well. Yeah. So you've got someone who's owning the project from the other side, so that you two can be working together to make sure that everything gets delivered to time and on budget.
Yeah, it's very important to have someone who's available, available to kind of pick up anything, but also be in close communication. But also it's very important to have one person who's a designated decision maker. Because we have worked on projects in the past where there have been kind of, say, 3 professors in one project, and they all want to be the decision maker, and it can get a little bit busy sometimes. So with Sure, it worked really well, because any kind of big decisions that needed to be made, we'd ask Jo and she would make the decision on that, and that keeps things ticking over nice and smoothly as well. So it's an important thing to think about.
Thank you, Elle. If you could just move us on again 2 slides, please. So we're just going to talk briefly about live, and I guess the importance of you've developed your product, but actually you do need to engage with users and get people onboarded, and it might well be in your research project that is all sorted, but it also might be the case that it's not. So it's really important to think right the way through that pathway. So Sarah, could you just talk a little bit about live and about analytics and about how we know whether the application or the website is doing what it's supposed to do?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think when you're live, really you want lots of people using it, or as many people as you plan to using it, so you can start collecting bigger amounts of data. You can start seeing patterns rather than just individual user cases. So this is a screenshot from Data Studio, which is a Google Analytics tool. It's from a project that we used to run that we don't run anymore. But you can see that dip in the last week. So we used to have dips like that when we were testing out comms, online marketing, to see which things worked and which things didn't, and how much impact they had if we turned one off or turned one on. But really you're trying to look for big patterns. You're still fixing stuff. You're still being aware of bugs and making sure that you're monitoring it, but really you're just trying to get a much bigger picture over a longer period of time so you can see bigger patterns, which I'm sure as researchers you know way more about than us. But it's also really useful to see things, and this page is much longer than this. It's just a snapshot, but you can see where people are coming from. If you put links out there into the world, you can tag them, so you can see which of your marketing is working the best or which isn't working at all, and you can remove it. You can see when people are visiting it. You can see which devices they're on. You can see where they're going next. With this project, we had it was a signposting service, so we had a lot of links going out to the site, so we could see which things were the most popular, where people were going, which meant that we could then make those things more prominent or put those things out there in a bigger way. So really you're using all of this data still to improve, but at a much slower rate than when you're in alpha and beta.
And I guess the other thing you want to be thinking about, of course, is the data that you want to get out of the back end for research purposes as well, which might be about analytics, or it might be the back end with it. And we'll talk a bit more about that. But Joe, I know that when we had our initial conversation, that was something that you were quite planned for and came up a bit late in the journey, but was really important.
Yeah, we were obviously aware of Google Analytics, and we were obviously aware that we wanted data out the back that we were going to analyse. But actually, we'd never sat down and had a discussion with Elle or with anybody about how the data was going to come out the back of the app. So fairly late in the day, we realised that we weren't speaking the same language, and that the data that was coming out the back wasn't in a way that we could actually analyse. But the process was really useful because we had to think very carefully about what it was, how we wanted it to come out, and then to convey it back in language that non-statisticians could understand. And I think it was due to the patience and forbearance of probably everybody that we got there, and the data comes out just as we want it. But there were moments when we thought, this is never going to work, is it? After all this, it's never going to work. We did it. So we were very pleased about that.
And I think I think Elle would back me up in saying there's never a project that doesn't have a glitch or something go wrong, which is why the relationship is so important, actually, and we'll come on to communication shortly. If we could move on now, though, we've talked about the Discovery Alpha Beta Live, so that sort of broad process. We're now going to talk about a typical team, so the sorts of roles that would be involved in design and developing an app or a website, and then we'll move on to some broader sort of considerations that you might want to give thought to as well. So Elle, could you just take us through a typical team that would be working on a project like this?
Yes, sure. So yeah, it's important to realise that obviously the building of an app or website is no quick or easy feat. There's a whole team behind. You might have one or two kind of connections on this side of things, but then there's lots of people working in the background. So for example, you'd have Sarah, who would kind of be overseeing it from an overall design and quality point of view, to check for accessibility and just ensure everything is to the standard that we'd expect. And then on the kind of development side, you'd have so a technology lead who would be responsible for kind of setting up the environments and making sure that all of that is kind of robust. And then a development manager who would be in charge of kind of assigning the various tasks to the developers within the team to build the actual features of the website or app. Then depending on how much of a discovery phase you have, you could also have UX researchers. You'll also have UX and UI designers to design the front end kind of user interface of your app or website. Very important, you have testers. They're extremely, well, they're essential. You absolutely need to have testers. Testing, as each sprint goes on, there will always be several days of testing within that to test for bugs and issues. And then there's also a technical project manager who will be managing the day-to-day workings of the developers. So we have part of our team, our developers are based in Pondicherry in India, but they work solely with us, and we work with them all day, every day. So it's kind of a very close-knit team despite the distance. But yeah, hopefully that gives a flavour of the kind of makeup of the team.
Thank you, Elle. And I think it's useful to know the sorts of roles and also the amount of people involved in developing an application as well, because then it starts to make sense. You know, these are quite substantial projects with quite a lot of different types of expertise and knowledge involved as well. So, you know, when you are speaking to teams, it's really and getting quotes and looking at who you might collaborate with, asking them who would be on the team, what sort of roles that they would be performing is a really important one for you to think about. Okay, we're going to move on from the team now. If we could have the next slide, we're going to look at some broader sort of general considerations that are particular to health research that you need to have in mind. So if we could have the next slide, please. And the first one I know is a real important one to Sarah, and that is designing for accessibility. So could you maybe just say something about how we would make sure that we design to meet lots of different needs?
Yeah, I'll try not to babble on because we're running out of time. But there are so the main thing is the WCAG guidelines, and that covers everything from development to design to content. So we try and aim for AA accessible. AAA is really difficult, but we always aim for AA, and that really is making sure that you are you're inclusive. So it's not about catering to disabilities; it's about making sure that anybody with any different kind of disability could use your website. So whether that's cognitive or visual or audio, so there are lots of things to consider, font sizes, but also making sure that it's coded properly, so semantically coded, that people can tab through a website if they've got motor difficulties. I've got a whole nother presentation I can do on accessibility, but if anyone's interested in talking about that in more depth, then drop me a line and we can do that, because I don't want to take up too much time and I could talk for ages about it.
I think the important thing is to flag up that it's really important to think about accessibility, and that's a key part of user-centered design. If we could have the next slide, please. And again, we won't dwell on this for very long, but if you're designing anything for use within a healthcare environment, you do need to be thinking about not only, of course, privacy, but also clinical safety. It's important that your tech partner has a data protection lead, but also ideally that they have some understanding of clinical safety, because you need clinical safety to be done on the health side, but also on the tech side as well. And that's just making sure that you identify potential hazards and you manage and mitigate those hazards and don't cause harm through your application. Okay, if we could have the next slide, please, Yulia. So Elle, do you want to just briefly say something you mentioned before about the importance of collaborative tools to keep that day-to-day communication going?
Yeah, so I mean, it's important to state here, so these tools are ones that we use internally with the team, but due to recent events, obviously with COVID, they've actually become very useful in working collaboratively as well. So for example, Slack, we can invite clients into Slack channels. We can also share, Rike is a project management tool, so we can also share specific tasks on that. And Miro is a relatively new design software which enables you to kind of collaboratively make things like user flows and diagrams, and we find that that's been working brilliant for us in workshops and things online in the new COVID age. So collaborative tools are definitely are a big part of a project. We can also work in whatever way, you know, if emails and calls are preferable, that's absolutely fine as well, but it's just worth pointing out these tools in case you're not aware of them.
Thank you very much, Elle. And we haven't really touched on COVID, but we've definitely found that with the situation we find ourselves with COVID, having tools like Miro that enable us to run workshops and do activities online has been increasingly important. So just because we are in this socially distanced sort of situation doesn't mean we can't do some of those co-design activities. In fact, we find some really nice benefits and sometimes involving people that wouldn't ordinarily get involved because we're doing it online. Okay, I'm going to move us on to the next slide, which is the all-important how you budget for a project. And we're not going to give you an easy answer, but we've had quite a few questions about this. And Simon's asked about research grants being fixed and carefully controlled and how hard it is to be flexible. I don't know whether
Victoria, sorry to butt in. I think we missed the third. We've got a message saying we missed the third consideration slide.
Oh, did we? We might just carry on going just because of time, but we will send the slide deck out, and if people have got questions, just give us a shout.
Yeah, it was quite an important one, just about different platforms that you might need and the number of users.
Oh yes, could you ping us back? Sorry.
Yeah, could you pop back to?
Ping us back, please. The one before.
That's it.
It's really important, actually. Thank you, whoever flagged that up. So, Elle, would you just like to talk about the integration?
Yeah, so it's important to realise that obviously if you're creating an app, your app will be for your front-end app users, but it's important to work out really early on whether you're going to require any other kind of system for users, for example, such as an admin panel. Especially if you're working to collect data for research purposes, you know, are you going to need an admin area where people can log in and see that data in a kind of visualized into graphs, for example, or it's also important to know very early on whether you're going to want to integrate to any other databases or any other systems, because that kind of thing always takes far longer than you'd think it would. Because there's lots of kind of hoops to jump through, especially if it's an NHS system. So it's just really important to think about that. And another thing we have touched on before was the analytics. But what kind of analytics do you want is kind of standard Google Analytics, being able to know which pages are most popular, etc. Is that enough, or do you need something a bit more substantial? All of these things are really good to start thinking about right from the beginning of your project, so that you can ensure you get the correct data and you get everything that you need out of your intervention.
And these also start to inform the budget as well. So if you're creating different front ends for different user groups, if you've got a back end system, if you're integrating with third-party databases, all of these have an implication in terms of budget and cost, which is why it's really hard to give very specific costings, because it really depends on how much needs to be built, and integration is a key part of that. So Julia, if you just move us back forward again, a few slides to budget. We're not going to give you the silver bullet for this because it is a bit of an art as well as a science. But as Simon puts in his question, you're often working to a fixed scope model, you've got a fixed budget, but actually things might shift. So building in that flex to a budget so that you can adapt and pivot is really important. Elle, I don't know whether you want to add anything to into that point around budgeting for a project.
Yeah, so as I briefly touched on earlier with regards to the priorities, I think it's important to make sure that you're aiming in your first kind of development cycle that you just want to do the MVP. And so really thinking about what the minimum viable product, the minimum version of your product could be that would enable you to kind of prove your concept or kind of test it out. Obviously, if you're designing to do a pilot, you might already have a good idea, and that would be more of a fixed scope model. Like, you know that it needs to do A, B, and C, and that's that, and it needs to be. But we're quite used to kind of working with fixed budgets and fixed scopes and trying to work out, for example, the simplest way we could implement a certain feature. So it might not be, you know, the very all bells and whistles version that you imagine, but if it does what it needs to do in, you know, within the budget and the scope, then, you know, it will still get you your data at the end of it. So it's important to, you know, in the budgeting stage, you can be flexible and just making sure that the priorities are the things that are being worked on, and they're kind of, you know, we don't want to have anything superfluous at that stage that might increase the budget for no valid reason.
Thank you, Elle. The other thing to be thinking about as well, of course, is hosting. You might want to host it yourselves on your servers in the university, or you might want it hosting in the cloud. So thinking that through, talking to your tech partner and working out which works best for your project. And also just being aware that for the time that that application or website is live, you do need maintenance, you might need upgrades, you might need to fix bugs, and you potentially need ongoing development and support. So it's just being aware of those sorts of ongoing running costs beyond the costs of actually designing and developing something. Okay, we're just going to move on to the final section now, Yulia, if you can move us forward. So in the last couple of slides, we're just going to share some of the stuff that we found important, and then it would be great to hear from Jo. We've got a slide, and Jo can maybe say a little bit about the project that you've actually, it's not a project, the research project and the application that you've developed. So these are the things that we think are important, the sorts of things that you might want to be talking to your potential partners around. So it's just so important to have that trusted relationship. And as I said before, things will go wrong, they inevitably will go wrong, but having the right relationship, being honest and realistic with each other, and getting those things set out from the get-go. You've got to like each other, you've got to get on, are really important to a productive relationship. Understanding each other's areas of expertise and using them is really important. So you will have really strong domain expertise as academics, and of course Sarah's got her design expertise, and I would never not defer to that. And Elle knows all about running projects, so it's understanding each other's areas of expertise and playing to those strengths. Always important to accept responsibility even when things go wrong, and working as a team to fix them, and finding those channels that work for everyone. Would anyone like to add anything to those? Jo or Elle or Sarah? Or are they pretty self-evident?
Quite self-evident, I think.
Okay, if we have the final, well, the penultimate slide, please. Okay, so yeah, we'd like to just finish by giving Jo an opportunity to talk about the Shore app that you've developed, Jo, and it would just be really useful, maybe if you could finish by sharing some broad points about your learning from academic to academic about the sorts of things, if you were doing this again, you'd have thought about and maybe do differently. That's always good to know.
Okay, yeah. So I think probably if I just pick up on the point about costs and timeframes, because again, that was quite important to us, and we were incredibly fortunate in that we had a budget, but we also had people offering us additional money, which is absolutely unheard of, I know, in any sort of research project. But because it was for the app, we had various donors who wanted to help contribute in any way they could. So we were very unfortunate that when we found things that we wanted to add in, within reason, we could actually add them in. When we found that we were running out of time, rather than rush it to get a product that was out there, we stepped back, and we had the luxury of having a little bit more time to actually develop it just as we wanted it. So I think if I was doing this again, I probably wouldn't be so fortunate in having an understanding funder and additional funders. So what I would do is make sure that my original estimate was under time and under cost, because I cannot see any way that you could actually get to the end of the process without wanting to add things in or changing things or coming across hurdles. The other thing that we learned quite late in the day is we were just so focused on developing this app. We wanted it to be really useful. We wanted people to like it. And when we got to the end of that process, we hadn't really thought beyond that. We had thought about the maintenance issues. We had thought about the run-in. We had thought about the content management system. But what we really hadn't developed was an implementation strategy. And actually, with hindsight, I think we thought we would tell everybody about it and that would be it. And of course, no app is like that. No health app is like that. You need to get people to use it. And it's fine me presenting at an international conference, but I'm not presenting to people who are actually going to use an addiction recovery app. It's fine me presenting to service providers. They might go on and tell some of their clients about the app. Actually, what we really need to do is tell people who are potentially going to use the app about the app and get them to buy in. And again, that's where we've been really fortunate, because we collaborate and have collaborated very closely with a group of service users. As we go into this implementation phase, we're finding that actually it's not me, it's not Alice, it's not the researchers doing the dissemination. It's Paul and Mel from the Aurora project, who have been our collaborators all along, who are actually speaking to user groups and getting them to understand what the app can do. So that's been quite a long journey for us. We've learned an awful lot about implementation, which I really wish we thought about before. But it's slowly coming together.
Thank you very much, Jo. And in the Q&A, not in the chat, because we've got the Q&A up as well as the chat, I've just posted a paper called the NAS Framework, which is a really great academic paper on non-adoption of technology and all the barriers to technology adoption within health and social care. So we have recorded this. We'll share the slides and we'll share the video as well when we've just had a chance to upload it. If we could have the final slide, please, Yulia. Just like to say thank you so much to all of you that have joined us for this last hour. I hope you found some of it useful. We're really happy to have follow-up conversations if you've got any outstanding questions, something we didn't get to answer, or something else, and we've got all our contact details up on the screen there. And thank you in particular to Jo for joining us. We really appreciate you getting involved and bringing academic perspective to this as well. So have a good evening, everybody. Stay safe, and thank you very much for your participation.
Just for the question that was on there about I've lost it now, about personas and chatting more, just email me and we can set something up if anyone wants to talk further about any of it.
Yeah, and there was a question about how long the Sure app took to build, which I accidentally deleted. I'm very sorry to whoever asked that. But it took, I would say the whole process of building it took around about a year, would you say, Jo?
Well,
I hope that helps. But yeah, please let us know if you have any other questions. We'd be happy to help. Thank you.